Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening. Welcome, everyone, to today's exciting virtual book launch of Irish Women's Prison Writing, Mother Ireland's Rebels, 1960 to 2010, by Red Washburn and brought out by Routledge Press. This book explores 50 years of Irish women's prison writing, connecting the work of women leaders and writers in the 6 counties of Ireland during the Troubles. The book documents and analyzes the ongoing Irish freedom struggle from an abolitionist feminist perspective, using personal correspondence, autobiographical narratives, and poetry of key women leaders and activists. As head of discipline of gender and women's studies in the School of Political Science and Sociology, it is my privilege to welcome our distinguished speakers today. First, I wish to introduce Red Washburn, the author of this thoughtful and incisive book. Red is professor of English and Director of Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies at Kingsborough College and affiliate faculty of Women's and Gender Studies at the Graduate Center, City University of New York. They are the co-editor of WSQ, which is published by Feminist Press, and have 2 poetry collections, Crestview, Tree Women, and Birch Philosopher X. They are co-editing WSQ's issue, Non-Binary, which is forthcoming in September 2023. They received an ACLS Mellon Fellowship for their next project, Non-Binary, Transforming Gender and Genre in Non-Binary Literature, Performance, and Visual Art. They have numerous articles, in the Journal of the Study of Radicalism, Women's Studies, an interdisciplinary journal, and Journal of Lesbian Studies. Their essays are in several anthologies, including Theory and Praxis, Women's and Gender Studies at Community Colleges, Introduction to Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, Interdisciplinary and Intersectional Approaches, and Trans Bodies, Trans Selves, a resource for the transgender community. Red is coordinator to the Lesbian Her Story Archives and is on the board of directors of the Center for LGBTQ Studies. We're also joined by Margareta D'Arcy, a well-known playwright, actress, and filmmaker in Galway. She was in Armagh Jail, and her writings are included in this collection of women's prison writing. She is a member of Asadona and lives in Galway. She was recently conferred an honorary doctoral degree in law by the University of Galway in November 2022. In 2017, she donated her papers and those of her late husband, playwright John Arden, to the University Archives. We're also pleased to welcome Eugene O'Brien, editor of the Routledge series in Irish literature. Eugene is Associate Professor and Head of Department of English Language and Literature in Mary Immaculate College, Limerick, Ireland. I look forward to hearing about this series and the contextualization of Red's book to the broader field. Let me now turn it over to Red to present an overview of this wonderful new book. Red?
Thank you so much, Netta. Good evening, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. Before I begin, I want to thank the Center for Global Women's Studies at the University of Galway for hosting this talk. I'm very grateful for this opportunity. I also want to give a special thank you to Netta and to Jillian for their help in organizing this event. I also want to thank Margareta and Eugene for their important work and also for being in conversation with me today. So this talk, Irish Women's Prison Writing, Mother Ireland's Rebels, 1960s to 2010s, is based on my book that came out last month. It connects the work of women leaders and writers in Ireland, focusing specifically on the Troubles. Covering 50 years of Irish women's prison writing, this project analyzes political communiques, petitions, news coverage, prison files, personal letters, poetry and short prose, and several memoirs of Irish women in the North, all of whom were targeted, arrested, and imprisoned for their political activities. I argue that these women's lives and words offer a different view of gender and nation, as well as a fuller and more inclusive archive of Irish history and literature. Furthermore, I point to the ways in which their politics of everyday life and their cultural work about it is a form of feminism, as well as speaking truth to power in a world in which compliance and silence are valued. It builds on many fields and discourses to reimagine gender and genre as central to an interdisciplinary and intersectional prison archive. I focus on women involved in People's Democracy, the Northern Ireland Civil Rights Association, the Irish Republican Socialist Party, the National H Block Armagh Committee, the Provisional Irish Republican Army, Women Against Imperialism, and Sinn Féin. I examine their leadership roles, individual voices, and cultural productions. In particular, I highlight the work of Bernadette Mapolaski, Eileen Hickey, Mairead Farrell, Sheila Dara, Ella O'Dwyer, Martina Anderson, Dolores Price, Marion McGlinchey, Anne and Eileen Gillespie, Rosalind Walsh, and Margaretta Darcy. Much of their prison writing was smuggled out on International Women's Day, written on toilet paper and or Bible paper, or was written on the prison walls in their own excrement and menstrual blood. All archival material was procured from the following sources: the National Archives of Ireland, the National Library of Ireland, the Public Record Office of Northern Ireland, the Linen Hall Library, the Sinn Féin Prisoner of War Department, and various online news sources. I also include personal data given to me by some of the writers, especially Rosalind Walsh, as well as prison files cleared by governmental bodies. In addition, this project features interviews with selected leaders and writers for supplemental data and interpreting their personal histories and writings. This book establishes links between several areas: nation and anti-colonialism, race and anti-racism, gender and feminism, literature and genre, content and analysis, and theory and praxis. Overall, the purpose of this book is to center Irish women's prison writings in order to challenge canonization in history and in literature. For this talk, I will focus my insights on Margaretta Darcy's writing, as she is here in conversation with me today. And thank you so much for joining me, Margaretta. I look forward to hearing what you have to say later. In her article, "It is my belief that Armagh is a feminist issue," Nell McCafferty writes, "There is menstrual blood on the walls of Armagh in Northern Ireland. The 32 women on the dirt strike there have not washed their bodies since February 8th, 1980. They use their cells as toilets. For more than 200 days now, they have lived amid their own excrement, urine, and blood. It is my belief Armagh is a feminist issue that demands our support." As a result of Darcy's activism on International Women's Day, she was arrested. Her autobiography is a remembering of this time for her, as well as the political prisoners for whom she was advocating. I explore how she reconstructed her personal image, rewrote history, and affirmed her liberatory political vision in her life and in her work. Darcy devotes much thematic attention to the politics of historical veracity and collective truth-telling in her writing. She explains her authorial intentionality as follows, and I'm quoting: "This is a non-dramatic and often rather absurd story of one person who found herself in Armagh prison for 3 months during the period of the No Wash protest in 1980. The women in Armagh said to me, 'Tell them everything,' and this I have tried to do. And since so few books have been written about Irish women's experience as political prisoners over the last 2 centuries, I felt it essential to put down my own small experience with all of its limitations.
No, I'm not going to overturn him.
Evident in this passage, speaking out was contraband. She notes the British government's usage of covert censorship, and she strategically used her outsider location as a white Southern working class woman to set the record straight, in her words, to tell them everything. Darcy also discusses patriarchal censorship within the Republican struggle. Her incisive criticism of Sinn Féin alludes to Republican women's invisibility in particular. For instance, Sinn Féin failed to acknowledge the hunger strike organized by Mairead Farrell, Mary Doyle, and Mairead Nugent in Armagh right away in order to instead focus on the hunger strikes in the H blocks, which resulted in the deaths of 9 men, including Bobby Sands. She writes, and I'm quoting, "The emphasis at the meeting was on the men in the H blocks. Women Against Imperialism pointed out that there were also women in Armagh prison. Sinn Féin was taking a rather cautious view of the new women's group. Eventually, such criticism resulted in her expulsion from the organization. In an interview with me, she shares a scathing indictment of Sinn Féin's male-centered tactics at the time. We need to stop seeing women as victims. Armagh women were not victims. Sinn Féin did not want to see it. The H blocks in Armagh were connected. Women started our own version of the H blocks. We were political prisoners. Sinn Féin wanted to hide the women in Armagh. The aspects of women's bodies shock people. Women's periods, births, and internal strip searches violated puritanical religion. Darcy's book speaks out against this silence. While her regional privilege informs her location, to which she admits, her feminist work on Republican history is indeed corrective and essential. She writes, and I'm quoting, "Only by being able to write my diary could I spill off my frustration and work my way to understanding of the young women's position. It recasts women as their own actors in her own script, not ancillary objects to be dealt with post-revolution. She centers the role of gender in the narrative of power and resistance to it. Instead of cowering in silence, she, quote, tells them everything about the collective experiences of her fellow intern Republican women." Darcy's reflections are important for understanding her use of vivid imagery and symbolism in her autobiography. She blurs the boundaries of politics and art in deliberate ways to call attention to fixed conceptions of reality and of genre. She devotes much time into crafting the symbolism of waste in her writing in particular. Republican prisoners produced art out of shitty conditions, literally. They swirled and inked the walls with their own excrement and menstrual blood in order to survive. Darcy writes the following: "I've had a shit. It's small and brown, hard as a nugget. Carefully wrapped in a tissue, she takes it to the wall. I want to puke. My nostrils are closed. I close my eyes. I open. She has covered a small section of the wall, a swirl, a small swirl. I apply it to the wall. I press hard. It falls off. I pick it up again, pressing it more lightly, as though I was touching a glass for a table wrapping session at a seance. Let it take itself over to the wall. It moves in thin lines. I am proud. The next time I shit, I am going to draw pictures. My drawing is lousy. I will practice." Darcy's shit is art. She writes about this process by using ironically aesthetic imagery for her fecal art. We can see her touching a glass, drafting thin lines, and drawing pictures. She uses shit to highlight the struggle for life amidst hell for women in prison and its transformation into something of collective value. Darcy also describes the conditions out of which this art is created with allegorical symbolism. She describes these deplorable conditions as follows. "We are called back to the filth, the cells covered with flies. Little happy flies, stubborn flies, flies that when you think you've got them, fly out of the windows. Dead flies, dried blood of fat flies, smearing shit on the walls, blue bottles that buzz, a mass of menacing nature trying to take over. Every morning, there are hundreds of flies on the walls, on the floors. We swat them. I feel like the proverbial white hunter. I try to have a truce with them. You can have the walls, but leave my body alone. No way. They crawl up my legs, land on my face. I hide under the filthy gray blanket. They sneak in. No mercy. No surrender. I am Paisley. I lash out, jumping on my springs and on my bars. Carefully get them. Some of them are stunned. I think they are dead. No, they recover. They are like the provos, unconquerable. They are everywhere. And then there are little ones that live in the skirting boards. Thousands of flies live there. This passage is flooded with adjectives to invoke the flies as literal presence. Little, happy, stubborn, dead, dried, fat, among others. She also transforms them into symbol. The flies' bodies invoke a colonial presence in her imagination. She fights back, swatting them, but they continue to oppress her like white hunters. They refuse a truce. They capture her body. They crawl on her. They land on her, and they hide in her parcels. She will not surrender, though. At the end, she identifies the fly swatters as the IRAs and the fly shit hovers as the colonial enemy. Her writing is exceptionally rich in detail and symbols in this passage, and it is a good feature to the life and work of women leaders and writers who I explore in my book. To conclude, this book focuses on rethinking and recasting women's voices and words across the spectrum of difference to document and promote the ongoing Irish freedom struggle from an abolitionist feminist perspective. This repositioning of women and their work is essential to archiving social movements for civil rights and cultural productions about them in the north of Ireland. Lastly, it is important to note that this tradition is relevant even now during this moment of transatlantic solidarity with Me Too and the movement for Black Lives, including in Ireland, post-Easter Rising Centennial, as part of the big conversations happening right now around the impacts of political repression and state attacks on social justice advocates and the harms of the carceral state. Thank you so much for listening, everybody. I will have more talks with other writers in this book and scholars in the field next semester. So please visit my website, www.redwashburn.com for more information. I'm really excited to celebrate this book launch with the Center for Global Women's Studies at the University of Galway and with everyone here today. Now we will move on to the other panelists, first with Eugene, followed by Margareta before our group discussion. Thank you so much.
Could you ever roll me a cigarette?
Hi, everybody. First of all, thank you very much for asking me, Red. It was a pleasure working with you. As the editor of the Routledge Studies in Irish Literature series, my remit when I was approached about doing this was that I didn't want to do just the same stuff that was already being done. I think there are a number of very good Irish literature, Irish study series out there, and I don't really see the point in just adding another name to the list. I wanted to do something different. I wanted to look at kind of theory, cultural theory, social theory. I wanted to look at interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary work. I wanted to look at areas of study that came at the interstices of other disciplines. In other words, I'm looking for new constellations, new ways of looking at Irishness, new ways of looking at Ireland, new ways, I suppose, of examining what it means to be Irish in the 21st century. Red's book is exactly the type of thing that we would be looking for here, because what he's doing is he's giving a voice. It's a truism, I think, and as someone who writes a lot about the likes of Jacques Derrida, I suppose I would say this, but it's a truism that life is done in binarisms, that binaries are what make us go. And it's interesting that even at the hunger strikes, that sex binary, that male-female binary, that male experience is more important, more ideologically significant, more likely to gain traction and followers than female. And I think read, you put it very well, and I'm really looking forward to hearing Margaret speak about her own experience. But as you read from her book and from her own experience, the idea that, the Republican movement was uncomfortable with the female body, I find that fascinating, because it's somewhere where they would, I suppose, the Republican movement and say the Loyalist or Unionist movement would have that in common. Women's bodies they're both very, very uncomfortable with. The government of the Republic of Ireland, again, the Magdalene Laundries with various revelations and stuff like that. Again, women's bodies seem to be the kind of ultimate thule. They seem to be in every ideology, in every political situation. We see it in Iran at the minute, where women are with extraordinary bravery, looking to voice their own freedom to dress how they so wish. And your book, I think, is doing that. It's giving voice to prisoners, and we lock prisoners away so we don't have to look at them, we don't have to listen to them, we don't have to think about them. So that carceral notion of silencing people is there. The women in Armagh were doubly silenced. The men in H-Block were silent but vocal. Their images and their bodies were seen as potent signifiers of a particular point of view, whereas the women in Armagh weren't. And you're right, it's because we don't like to talk about menstrual blood. It makes men uncomfortable, and as it's by and large still patriarchal hegemony in kind of culture and social practices, we don't want to talk about it, so we don't hear about it. And I think this book is addressing that. It's addressing prison, which I think, is something we all need to look at, because I don't know, is it doing any good for anybody in any society, to be honest about it. I think we need to look at the voices of women and who are not being given a chance to speak. And I suppose just to finish, because I see my role here as basically just celebrating that I'm delighted the book is there. I'm delighted it's in the series. I look forward to it being reviewed and starting a discourse and maybe getting people talking about these areas. We'll be coming through with a number of other books. We're looking, interestingly, at trauma, memory, and silence of Irish women in contemporary literature, which is going to tie right in here. We're going to look at the short story, again, looking at a lot of female experience from a Spanish colleague, Madalena Armi. We'll be looking at Seamus Heaney, who has written quite a bit about the North, about women's experience and about everything in a book called Seamus Heaney's Myth-Making. Basically, I think this is an important book. I think it's an uncomfortable book. I think it's an uncomfortable book to read at times. I think it's an uncomfortable book to think about. I think it forces us to look at people who, from one political perspective, we make into heroes, from another political perspective, we make into demons. And I think it's asking us to ask real serious questions about the lived experience of these people, especially women, which is a different and a segmented aspect of experience, and it's forcing us to look at that. And I think if the book did nothing else, and I think it does plenty, but if it did nothing else, it would earn its keep by forcing that level of attention on us. So thanks very much for having me. Thank you very much for considering the series, and I look forward to seeing the book and yourself make its way in the world as it goes forward. So thank you very much.
So now we'd like to hear from you, Margareta,
Okay.
with bated breath, I would say.
Yes. Okay, well, first of all, I'd like to thank Red very much for highlighting my book. This is the first time ever that anyone has taken any notice of my book in the 26 counties. So I'm quite unnerved by the whole experience. And I certainly am not going to be able to talk as fluently as you learned professors who I suppose are used to every day talking to students. I would just like to begin. And I think that the struggle of women in the Armagh really was recognized when Rita O'Hare took the important step of setting up its own women's committee. It is only when the Republican movement recognizes the oppression of women and sees clearly where it comes from, imperialism, social and economic, that the selflessness, the dedication, and the ultimate sacrifice paid by willing volunteers will be truly recognized. And I think now inside the Republican movement, they are beginning to understand that actually there's quite a lot of kudos from actually celebrating the enormous struggle that the women in Armagh jail did. I mean, we have Michelle O'Neill, we have Mary Lou, we have women now in leadership, and if it hadn't been for the women in Armagh, these changes would never have taken place. And not only is it the women in Armagh who made these changes, but the hundreds of women who came from outside and flooded into Belfast in the protests. I mean, this was astonishing. They had never seen in Belfast anyone like these women. All right, the women were lesbians. They were committed to women as women. They called out the men, but they were there. And they changed the whole color of West Belfast. Women Against Imperialism. I mean, this is an extraordinary group that has really got to be recognized. In 1978, John Arden and I were invited to take part in the Belfast Arts Festival. We had a play on the Vandeleurs Folly, and we were asked then to give a speech. I had spoken with Enda Longley, who was an academic there, and I had said to her, I felt pretty uncomfortable about what was happening because the H block marches have been banned, pictures have been taken down from the Ulster Museum because they were not acceptable. And I said, I'm really not happy. And she said, come to the poetry reading in the Ulster Museum, and there I'm sure you will find some kind of satisfaction. So off I went. What did I find? Two male poets, Paul Muldoon. He read a poem and mentioned about a 17th century painter who'd been banned, and Michael Longley, who, believe it or not, was, turned out, Director of Literature and Traditional Arts of the Arts Council from 1970 to 1991. He was there in the Arts Council. He was the one who invited me. And when I saw the empty walls, and Michael Longley had just referred to a very famous painter called Gerard Dillon, who came from the Falls Road. So Michael Longley mentioned Gerard Dillon coming from the Falls Road. Mentioning the Falls Road was meant to be the code. Yes, I recognize the Falls Road. He is a great artist, comes from the Falls Road. I could not take this double speak. And so the empty spaces on the walls, I took out a little red pen, began doing H block, and the panic inside the poetry reading was unbelievable. I mean, really one would have felt they had brought out a gun or something or other. I mean, they just screamed. The museum attendants came in, knocked me down, dragged me out. Did Michael Longley say anything? Did Paul Muldoon say anything? Did anyone say anything? No, no, this is acceptable inside the North, because what had come about was Roy Mason's new policy of normalization and criminalization. Normalization meant you went along with status quo. If you in any way veered from the status quo, you were then labeled as a criminal. So I became a criminal. And do you know what my charges were? 3 assaults, incitement to riot, and defamation of a public monument. I mean, these are really serious charges. I mean, it's absurd. One would have thought that I was some kind. I suppose I like the RUC because they really have imagination. So if they're going to pick somebody up, that person has to be such an extremist that no force can hold them except to be put into jail. So I then began to understand the whole nature of art in north of Ireland. The collaboration between the Arts Council in the north and the Arts Council in the south. The message was the same: normalization. Don't rock the boat. So that was my first time in Armagh jail. So the director of literature, I was invisible. They didn't even ring up John to say that I had been put into jail. They didn't bring a lawyer down. They brought nothing. There I was in Castlereagh, which is a notorious place for torture. So about midnight, fortunately, my hero came. It was a lawyer called McGlory. He looked at me. I looked at him. He looked at me. I looked at him. And he said, they're going to certify you in the morning. They're going to put you into the loony bin. I said, oh, could you ever get me some cigarettes? So off he went to get me the cigarettes. And then we decided I was not willing to recognize the court, that I would instead have conversation about the meaning of art. What is art? When is art? Where is art? So we agreed. So off I went into Armagh for about 3 weeks waiting for my trial. When I had my trial, now the contradictions of North of Ireland. So you had a very charming magistrate who absolutely agreed with me. Yes, we're not going to have a trial. Yes, we'll have conversations. Yes, we'll do this. So I asked for the attendants who would drag me out. I said, did anyone ask you to take the pictures down? And they said, no. They were told to take the pictures down. So who then was the powers to be who actually interfered with art in North of Ireland? It was the trustees of the Ulster Museum. It was the director of literature who had invited me. It taught me a lesson. It doesn't matter how many books you write, what plays are put on, how famous you are. In the north of Ireland, if you in any way move from one little space into another little space, you are then labeled a criminal. Now, the Women Against Imperialism, I didn't know them, they didn't know me, is that they had put a little notice of solidarity to me in the Irish News. And I thought this was absolutely wonderful. And it just shows you, and I hope it shows everyone, that when struggles are taking place, even though you don't know the person, that little bit of solidarity changes everything. Now, you might be interested to know, when I was in India, the same thing happened, because we were in Guwahati, and once again, we were all thrown down, me and my children were thrown into jail. And we got a wonderful letter of solidarity from the Guwahati journalists. They didn't know us, we didn't know them, but it's these little things that changes one's perception of life. So one is not alone. So it appears you are alone, and it appears what you're doing is totally off the wall, but somebody is listening. So later on, when I went back to Armagh to pick up my belongings, Women Against Imperialism asked me if I would like to join their demonstration. Now, this is the first time ever that a demonstration had taken place in Armagh. which is notorious as what we call it, it's a black town. It's the Unionists. So there we all were. The women inside knew that we were there, and we were there singing our songs and jumping around and enjoying ourselves, when suddenly they grabbed hold of us. And that is what began my journey into Armagh. So that, of course, I was nervous because I did not belong to IRA. I didn't belong to Sinn Féin. I had belonged to official Sinn Féin, and the official Sinn Féin and the Provos were at this time exchanged in bumping each other off. So I naturally thought, because they're not going to accept me, I had been thrown out of the official Sinn Féin. So in that sense, I was quite clear. The sophistication of Mairead Farrell to actually be able to say, yes, you can join us. People always think going to jail is a simple thing. It isn't a simple thing. You have to navigate. Where am I going? Who's going to look after me? But Mairead said, is come along. So I then became part of this tribe. In a way, we were a tribe. We looked different because we didn't wash. So we were like lovely zebras, black and white, or can we say gray and white, while the enemy, they were pink and white. So we looked different. We were completely different. We had, in a way, developed our own anthropological inner world where we were able to accept what in ordinary society is the unthinkable, which is putting your shit on the wall. But what was the extraordinary thing? Every 2 weeks they would come along and they would hose the cell, and we would then be put into these clean cells. The clean cells were horrible. They became an alien place, so that the sooner then we were able to put our shit up on the wall, then we felt cozy and we felt protected. I think people don't realize the protection that you get from using the resources of your own body. And I felt that our shit was our protection. So when I left, of course, I think I should also mention the fact is that because of all the disputes, now when we talk about normalization, criminalization, what we've got to understand is fear. People are terrified. In the South, they were terrified. We had Section 31, which is that no one was allowed to talk on the television in any way supporting what was happening in the North. Forcible entry bill. Forcible entry bill was that if in any way they thought that you were supporting the IRA, is the guards could arrest you. And if it was in the middle of the night, they could tie you to that kitchen table and keep you there until the following morning. Offences against the State Act. There was a climate of fear in the 26 counties, which I don't think they ever understood up in the North. They thought we were free in the 26 counties. We were not free. You still had the knock on the door in the middle of the night. So they would be searching, for anything that they wanted. And people were not safe. So that the turbulence inside the women's movement and the arguments that we have about, do we support the women in Armagh? Should we support them by going to jail? They were horrendous. The other thing that I'm also going to say, which is that the amount of spies that were in the 26 counties from 1970 on So the CIA, MI5, KBG, as well as our own lot, all milling round. Now, when the history of Armagh is ever going to be written, there is no doubt about it. Who was stirring up the shit? Who was making all these divisions? Who was controlling us? And by two of us going into Armagh jail, that was such a threat. Why? I mean, it's quite a reasonable, logical kind of thing. You have a little demo outside a prison. And why the way that we were swept away and suddenly the implications is that we were involved with bombs. I mean, I remember one RUC man came along and said, "Oh, you look very familiar. Short strand. I know your face." It's all that. So you had the intimidation in the north, and you had the intimidation in the south. I am glad I experienced all this. I'm glad that I became a criminal. And when I left Armagh jail, I was determined to keep up my status. And so I set up a parish radio against the Irish government, 2 years in jail, £20,000 fine, 6 months for anyone who participated. But once again, I had the support of women round the world. So once one has the support of women, one has nothing to fear. I think I've got 10 minutes done now. I think my 10 minutes is over.
Listening to you speak, I'm remembering struggles in India and the
yes.
kind of similar types of oppression that was there in the freedom struggle, in the post-freedom context,
Yes.
with left movements, and today now with the BJP government and fundamentalist, the rise of fundamentalism again.
Yes.
But it also shows the importance of the expression and the writing.
Yes.
So I wanted to ask a question of all of you, maybe starting with Red. Why is it important to think about Irish women prison writing as part of Irish literature? Because this is a subsect of Irish literature.
Because at the moment, 19th century women's writing is recognized. I mean, Oscar Wilde's mother was a great writer. So at the moment, it's constantly, the past is remembered, but the present is ignored. And I think it is because it's a very unique experience with the women in Armagh. They're very young, very, very young. They were not, you might say, third level education. Their poetry came from the heart. And there is an authenticity and a freshness there that we need to hear. Now, when we talk about the 19th century women poets, I mean, they were quite structured, really, is they had some idea how to write their poems. And there was that kind of flair and polish to their poetry. But the women in Armagh, they didn't have that polish. They had an authenticity, which we must hear. And I think that's very, very important, because if we are not allowed to hear them, we are missing an enormous amount of literature. At the moment, as I said, between the Arts Council and the North of Arts Council and the Irish Arts Council, yeah, we have our Seamus Heaney and Michael Longley and Paul Muldoon and all these people who have so many books to be able to look up the proper word. They have so many examples. Oh, yes, I'll work it, I'll work it, I'll work it. And they become very important people. But the women in Armagh James, they had no books. It just came from them. And I think that this is the real poetry. The real poetry is when it comes from inside you and you put it on the page. And there was actually a remark, and this is what the English critics say, oh, Republican poetry, no. Oh, no, it does all the same old thing. I'll just find the quote of this dreadful man, if I can find him. Oh, yeah, something called Christopher Walker about the H Block prisoners' protest. The prose in the Republican newspapers is often accompanied by poetry written by protesters anxious to boost up their role as patriots. And I think this is how a lot of the Republican poetry is regarded. Instead, we now, oh yes, the other thing Margaret Longley was head of was traditional arts. We are great now on the authenticity of the voice. So we just love now to be able to go back and listen to how we used to speak and authentic language. I mean, my own viewpoint about poetry is I think that Paddy Kavanagh is actually the only real poet because he does have an authentic language. The others don't have an authentic language, but it's this authenticity that has got to come through. Otherwise, we will never understand poetry and we will never understand women.
And Red, do you want to add to that? Because I think that's a very important point that Margareta has said.
Well, I think that really,
Margareta, let Red speak.
I don't want to criticize the Republican movement, but I don't think that they know what a gold mine they have. What we should have is poetry readings of this poetry in the Ulster Museum, in Dublin, in the poetry societies, this kind of thing. We need to hear their voices. If we don't hear their voices, I know, I mean, I was quite amazed about the history of Rosalind Walsh, 35 plays she's written. I'd never heard of her. Why not?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, Margaret, thank you so much for speaking. And I think Rosalind's actually a really good place to start, which is, I have, a big commitment to hearing different voices in general. I think there are many good folks in the canon, but I also think the problem is not with who is in the canon, it's the politics around who is selected to be a part of a very white gentlemanly artifact. So for me, I'm really interested in diversity and thinking about how everything is political, including the writing people produce, questioning who is writing and from what perspective, and who has the ability to write and how they write and who they are and how that informs their work. And I think some of it is really around canon expansion. So canon expansion in many ways in terms of actual identity politics. So thinking about the politics of race, class, gender, sexuality, age, religion, all of those markers. And then in addition to that, thinking about issues connected to genre. So what genres are traditionally accepted within a canon? Oftentimes, memoir is not accepted in the canon. Oftentimes, things like prison writing, Holocaust testimonials, slave narratives, online blogs, any kind of political writing, even though I think all writing is political, where do those type of genres fit in? And I think now there's been renewed interest around sci-fi and fantasy, especially during the pandemic. But I remember a point during graduate school where that was questioned too, when people were doing work in sci-fi. So Irish women's prison writing, I think, fulfills both of those markers of identity and thinking about expanding genre representation. But I also think that we're at a point where we can actually discuss abolition and think about defunding police, as Eugene said, like actually think about why prisons exist in the first place, why we put people in cages, why people are homeless, why people can't have, access to an education, why they don't have access to jobs, and think about that as a larger political a larger political issue. So I'll stop there, but I think that we are at a point where these conversations around prison and prison writing are front and center. And I think that we should keep having these discussions around prison writing generally, not just Irish women's prison writing, but prison writing in general and prison issues in general. I'm curious your thoughts, Eugene, if you want to jump in.
Sure, yeah. I think it's important that we I think it's important that when we look at the creation of canons, and I mean, yeah, the canons are there and they're there for all sorts of reasons. And I wouldn't be in favor of throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but I'd be very much in favor of making a bigger bath and bringing a lot more people into it. Very often people who are in prison are working class, like in every society, every culture you look at, the stats are huge. And there's an area in contemporary literary and critical studies coming in now, like working class poetry, working class writing, working class novels, where the views and the ideology and the aspirations of a particular class are no longer seen as wrong and having to be educated out of them to put them into middle class. And I think, like, I take Margaretta's point there, that there's a lot of extraordinarily decent, strong, visceral poetry coming out of people. And poetry, if anything, is about the particular, the body, the individual stuff. And I was fascinated when she said that going from a cell covered in blood and fecal matter into a clean one. On a very banal level, I had to get a growth removed from my foot about 4 weeks ago, and I couldn't have a shower because, of course, you can't. The wound is still there, and you can't get wet. And today was my first shower in 4 weeks. I thought it was bliss. I thought it was heaven. And when Margareta said that they moved into the clean cell, I was thinking, oh God, that must be nice. At least you had a while in the clean cell. And she said, no, it's the body, the familiarity of the body. If you like, the moving of your body onto the walls of the cell, making your body bigger and turning the cage into a womb almost, where you're comfortable and your bodily stuff is on the edge of it. That's poetry in my book. That's the kind of stuff that you're not going to get in a middle class, dainty little, 32 volume or 32 page book of poetry. Nothing wrong with those. There's some great stuff in it. I've written books about Heaney and other poets myself. But what she's talking about there, that's, I think, where there are huge areas to discuss. And I'd be very much in favor of doing that, and very much in favor of seeing that kind of thing written about more so.
Thank you, Eugene. There is a question from the audience. So let me read this out because I think it's to you, Red. So this is from Audacia Ray. She says the book is very much about the experiences women had in sex-segregated prisons with sexism in the Republican movement and sexism in the Republican movement. Red, how do you see your work on Irish women's prison writing in conversation with the new project you're working on about non-binary literature?
Thank you so much. I'll just say that, I think there's a lot of connections around thinking about barriers and borders and destabilizing gender norms or any kind of norms that are not helpful to people. Those can be questioning the kind of divisions between, unionist, Republican, or white, or Black, or male, or female. And I think those are important in that way. And I think that the Irish prisoners in this study, but also I would highly recommend if people want to check out In the Footsteps of Anne, an anthology of Irish women's prison writing that came out shortly after my dissertation. And there's so many women in there, and they talk about gender deviance across the board. They talk about wearing black as, being unladylike, wearing parka jackets, menstrual blood as challenging gender norms. Talking back was, heavily punished because it was challenging patriarchal expectations of silence. So I think in the actual prisons, the women were doing it, and the current project I'm doing is focusing more on non-binary literature as, on its own terms, as its own identity. And I am looking at, issues of confinement and issues of borders, and thinking about national borders and thinking about gender borders, and questioning things like racial purity and questioning the gender binary. So I think that they are in conversation. It's not exclusively about prison, but some of the same themes around like confinement, dehumanization, repression come up in the current work I'm doing. But Margaret, I'm curious if you want to jump in to talk about some of the experiences of sexism or gender norms in the prison.
Yeah, I just wanted to say that I think it's very important to hear poetry, because when you hear the words of what these women have in their hearts, it makes a big difference to actually just reading it. And what I would like is for the Republican movement and these poets to actually demand that their voices are heard. And all these poets, there are so many bloody poetry festivals all over the place. I mean, it's just, everyone seems to be writing poetry, but the one thing we don't hear are actually prisoners' poetry. I mean, this is off the point of it. When I was in Limerick jail, is that the women, they wrote poetry, and it was fantastic. And they got their own little magazine. And then what happened? It was cut. They were no longer allowed to have their poetry magazine. We need to hear we need to hear them, not just read them, hear the voices.
No, that's a very important point. There's also another question that has come, which is very interesting. This is from Sam. Does anyone want to comment on the relationship between political prisoners like Margareta and other prisoners, especially women, who are overwhelmingly prisoners of decisions made by politicians creating poverty, who are prisoners because of the conditions of poverty?
Well, I would just like to say from my experience in Limerick and in Dublin, the government sends 3.5 billion on actually keeping us in jail. You have a whole machinery, you have a whole world inside there. And who are the ones making the money? The lawyers, the social workers, the police. And the women are just treated as if there's some kind of dried vegetables. They are not treated as human beings. When they go in there, I mean, the doctors are absolutely appalling. If anyone is listening, would they mind doing something and go into Limerick jail in the women's section, and you will find out how women live there. It is an absolute disgrace. And instead, when I bring it up, they say, oh, yes, we have a committee and we're going to make a new jail. And in the meanwhile, that is not good enough. The actual psychological effect of going into Limerick jail when there's no light, it's dungeons, broken down old furniture. How can women have any self-respect or any aesthetic delight in anything when you are living like that? And this is what's happening now.
I mean, I can just take.
Yes,
sorry.
Fred.
Go ahead, Mark. No, I was just gonna say, I think quickly that this is a great question, and this is one of the issues that I bring up actually in my conclusion around the marker political prisoner. Obviously, that denotes a very particular type of prisoner who's challenging criminal status, but also we can use the term political to talk about many people who are in prison who are overwhelmingly non-white people, overwhelmingly, poor people, so thinking about some of the politics of race and class and gender, I think could be applicable, not just in Ireland, but I think, in the US or, many other countries. So I think that's a really good point, is really thinking about prisons as a political project and the occupants as participating in that project involuntarily. So Eugene, do you have any thoughts on that?
Well, he's in Limerick, isn't he?
I am indeed.
Go to Limerick jail and see what's going on there.
I actually gave some talks in Limerick jail a number of years ago to some students, but some prisoners, but they were male, not female.
That's it. The Mail have a lovely jail there.
They've a new one there now, yeah, but they've started making a new one anyway. I think it's academics. I think a lot of us are well paid and cozy, and not the younger ones coming in because of massive precarity in the profession. But I think it behoves us as a kind of a social duty to look at exactly the kind of things that you, Red, and you, Margareta, are talking about. That if we don't push with younger people that we're talking to for a fairer and a better division in society, and just for looking at things like that, the people who are in jail invariably are poor, invariably are non-white, invariably are people who have been set up to do it, and not to challenge the statistics that, oh, well, people are in jail because they commit crimes. There's an awful lot of middle-class crimes in Ireland over the past number of years. There's nobody in jail over them, and nobody ever will be, and we all know that. So I think it's important for us to do that, and that's where discussions like this and books like that and your new project, Red, by getting that out to younger people and to students, it's a slow process, but I think it's one that may gradually bring change around in the way we look at stuff. And I'd have great hope for some of the people that I teach who are in their 20s. A lot of them would be very, very socially aware and socially active. And I don't know if our generation, I think Margareta's played her part now. I don't know about our generation generally about that kind of thing, but I think that's a big plus, to be honest with you.
Can I say something?
Yes.
I need to change the title of those women who are in jail. They're on the whole unsuccessful venture capitalists.
Yes. That is very true. And there is a lot to learn from the failure of the entire system from looking at these unsuccessful venture capitalists.
Yes.
So with this, I think we need to close.
Yeah.
And so I really want to thank all of you for a very powerful conversation. I didn't know quite what to expect, but this has really been amazingly powerful and a very important aspect of life that we need to be much more concerned about, of all these women who are in prisons and their voices, as Margareta has said, that we need to hear those voices. I also want to thank Gillian, who's been in the background thinking about voices. Gillian has done all the invisible work that goes into organizing a webinar. And she's been behind the screen, and now she's in front of the screen. And I really, really want to thank Gillian, because without her, none of us would be here talking. So thank you.
Thanks,
I also want to thank Nata, Jillian, Eugene, and Margareta. Thank you so much.
The recording will be, link will be sent to everyone who has registered for the webinar. Thank you. And have
Thank
a
you.
good